Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight is the second part of a two-part special edition on the commemoration, the 24th commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. This evening's discussion will focus on the education of Rwandan youth in the genocide against the Tutsi as a tool of prevention. This evening we'll also be examining the education system and the impact of teaching genocide studies to young Rwandans to ensure never again to the tragic events of 1994. My name is Dana Mpisi, and joining us this evening, we have two guests. I'm going to start with you, Enoch. We have Enoch Semuwemba from Aegis Trust. He's the education manager. Enoch, thank you very much for honoring our invitation this night.
Thank you. I'm happy to be part of the panel.
Thank you. We are also joined by Eric Mahoro, and Eric is the head of programs from Never Again Rwanda.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. As usual, The Square, comprises of myself and my three other colleagues. Unfortunately, Berna is not with us this evening. She's a bit under the weather. But as always, I'm joined by Ephraim Rwamwenge.
Yes.
Ephraim, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And Charles Haber, as always, part of The Square. It's a pleasure to have you.
Good evening, Dan, and how are you?
Good.
Yeah.
So before we kick off into this evening, as usual, what we usually do on The Square is we look at events that happened in the past week. And before we started, there's a couple of things that we wanted to talk about, not really to do with the show, but just a recap of the week before we take a deep dive into today's topic. Ephraim, I'll start with you.
For me, I would say highlight of the week was in relation to my favorite institution in Rwanda, RSSB, and Vision City. There was an article published in the East African, and obviously amongst some circles, it sparked a conversation around housing and investments. So yeah, I'm not going to get into the details of it. That's a topic for another show, but. Yeah, that was the week that was for me.
The week that was.
Yeah.
Charles, what about you?
I attended a very, very interesting meeting on yesterday on Tuesday. For the first time, in as far as I can remember, the RDB and the city of Kigali convened local investors, the richest Rwandan men in Rwanda, called them into this arena, bought them sumptuous breakfast, and asked them about their problems. We are accustomed to the red carpet being given to foreign investors. I think it was extremely important, and I hope it was not just a PR move that the RDB and especially the city of Kigali wanted to hear from the biggest investors in Rwanda, who are the local investors, on what they are doing. I think that was my highlight of the week. Yes,
my question for you, though, is this similar to what usually a private sector federation does, where they actually have quarterly meetings and invite people from the business community to just air out the problems? Is this something similar?
First of all, thank you for letting me know that the private sector federation actually does that.
Yeah, on a quarterly basis.
But because as a PSF member and a high taxpayer, I didn't know that. But thank you for letting me know about that. But this particular one, unfortunately, I had a problem with the approach. That the city of Kigali and the Ministry of Commerce and RDB dominated about 2/3 of the meeting with usual politically pregnant speeches that they give, but and they left a third to the juiciest part, which is hearing back from the business community. But that third was extremely resourceful, and again, giving credit where it's due, I'm extremely impressed that the government is now willing to listen to local investors and engaging them further. I think it was really a fantastic step in the right direction. Yeah.
Well, for me, my highlight of this week was the Rwanda Investigative Bureau that was launched yesterday. Was it yesterday?
Yeah.
Yes.
The handover
today.
The handover was today.
Yes.
But I think this is something definitely we should have on our show, just understanding its role vis-a-vis the police, vis-a-vis NISS, and just understanding how this particular agency will work in tandem with other security agencies. So that was, for us, some of us, this was our recap of the week. But today, like we said, we're here to talk about the role of education amongst Rwandan youth as a tool of prevention of genocide. And tonight we have opinion leaders and experts in their fields who are going to just shed some more light on this topic. And before we begin, I'll start with you, Enoch. Can you just tell us briefly what you do, where you work, and how it ties in with what we're about to discuss this evening?
Thank you, Diana. At Aegis Trust is a non-government organization whose role is to prevent genocide and mass atrocities from happening. But in relation to what I do as education manager is in Aegis Trust we have several education projects, peace education projects that we implement with other partners. And currently we're implementing 3 big projects, which is the Education for Sustainable Peace in Rwanda, where we work with educators, the teachers in schools and the parents and the youth. And then we also have the Healing Our Community project, which is basically for the youth. And then we have the digital platform to support education for sustainable peace in Rwanda. All these are from the donor agencies support, but also with other partners that we work with. So it's really, today's discussion is really in line with what we do, because the target audience is the teachers, the youth in schools, out of school, and also the parents, and then the decision makers who are the policy drivers in this country.
Okay. Eric Mahoro from Never Again Rwanda, please share with us your work.
Sure, thanks. As the name goes, we're here to work together with the rest of the Rwandan people to try and ensure that the genocide doesn't happen again. And at Never Again, we believe that doing so, it's crucial to invest in peace building, which in our case has 2 major units. One of it looking at the healing, because we recognized a lot of healing needs in our community. So it's been 24 years down the road, but we acknowledge that people are still wounded and have been affected differently by the history of the genocide against Tutsi. At the same time, we have another peace education unit, and I would say 90% of it focuses on the young people, because we believe these are not just the future, but also the present. So obviously what we're doing today in terms of educating them about the history of the genocide, and also engaging them in activities that promote unity and reconciliation, will definitely help build a better future for them and for the Rwandans in general.
Thank you very much, Eric. So I'm going to dive into our first question for this evening. And as always, my fellow panelists, Ephraim and Charles, please dig in where you see fit. So there's a theory that states, and I'm sure many of you have heard it before, that a genocide is likely to most happen where it has happened before, if its future generations are not educated about it. And this is what we want to discuss this evening. So that said, the first question I'd like to put to you, Eric and Enoch, is if you can tell us, based on your experience, what is the status of genocide studies in national curricula in Rwanda from a primary, secondary, and higher learning level? And is there specific training for teachers who teach it? Because you understand this is a topic that's just it's not regular, and there has to be some specialty, especially some training in the people who implement the lessons. So would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. As you're all aware, the curriculum has gone into several changes. The latest change was in 2016, when the curriculum moved from knowledge-based to competency-based. And under competency-based, what the Ministry of Education and Rwanda Education Board did was to have 8 cross-cutting issues. So teachers go to class and teach the regular subjects, but then we have 8 cross-cutting issues, of which genocide studies is part. We have inclusive education, we have gender, we have peace and values education. So the thing is that the teacher of history, of mathematics, of physics would come into the classroom, but then we'll make sure that he or she touches best with genocide studies, peace and values education, and so on. So the move by the Minister of Education was to was to have students graduate or leave primary school or high school with the skills, knowledge and attitudes that they can easily implement outside school. So when you go back to genocide studies in particular, what we are privileged as Aegis Trust to do on behalf of the government and Rwanda Education Board, we train teachers on peace and values education. Right now we have trained over 3,000 teachers in the country, but the approach from the ministry is a multiplier effect. We cannot reach out to all 70,000 teachers in the country, so we have a cascading approach where we work with the national teacher trainers, who then go down to the sector-based trainers, and then go down to the school-based
Where do you get your money from?
That's a good question, Charles. We get, depending on the project that we are currently implementing. Right now, the Education for Sustainable Peace in Rwanda we get the funding from CEDA, the Swedish Development Agency. But also other projects, we have, like the Healing Our Community project is for the youth that is from USAID. And then the digital platform is from the Belgian embassy. So we get from multiple donors, but all of them have the same focus, which is to have sustainable peace in the country.
Can you just talk a bit more about the cascading, the multiplier effect that you said? Because you said you've trained 3,000 teachers so far. In what time period?
So from 2013 up to today, we've trained over 3,000. But the most recent training that we did with the Rwanda Education Board was in December 2016, where we trained the national teacher trainers. So we have 150 national teacher trainers who work in all the 30 districts. But then we have 416 sectors. So these national teacher trainers work with over 1,400 sector-based trainers who will then go down to the schools themselves to work with the teachers. So we don't work in exclusion. Rwanda Education Board says this is competency-based curriculum training, and then Aegis Trust comes in on the bit of genocide studies and peace and values education. Other partner organizations come in for gender, for inclusive education. So we all work together on mentoring and training the teachers so that it goes down and reach up to the 70,000.
And if I'm just curious, we're in 2018 and the last training was in 2016. Is there a mechanism to follow up to find out how effective, one, your training has been, and two, whether the uptake or the embracement of some of these trainings is actually working?
Yeah, thank you, Ephraim. So the one in December 2016 was the national teacher trainers. But we're actually also training, working with REB to train the sector-based trainers. So far from then up to today, we have had 8 workshops with sector-based trainers. And these workshops have been at the Kigali Peace School, at the Memorial, and also in Karongi Peace School in the Western Province. So we keep in touch with these teachers, and also we have worked with the school inspectors. We have 30 inspectors in the country, where there's a school inspector per district. So we train the school inspectors. Once they go into the classroom and follow up with the teachers, they see whether the teachers actually are implementing peace and values education, as we have talked about, genocide studies, inclusivity. So we ensure that we work with all the stakeholders. We don't just work with the teachers alone. So
do you believe that the framework around which education of again, as you called it, genocide studies, do you think the framework is solid enough, or is there still room for improvement?
There's always room for improvement, but so far the results, the research that we have done is we are on the right track. But the room for improvement is still the cascading approach has not yet reached the 70,000 teachers. Why? Because the national teacher trainers are also teachers. Their job is not to train others. They're also teachers in their schools. So they go to class and teach on a daily, but then they also are also tasked with training other.
But if I'm not wrong, the decision by I don't know if it's Ministry of Education or Rwanda Education Board was, I think, the decision to start educating, or at least introduce genocide studies into the curriculum started in 2008.
Yes, in 2008.
Now my question is, from 2008 up until 2018, that's 10 years. You're telling me we still haven't been able to reach all 70,000 teachers?
No, we have.
Sorry, just before you come to that, Enoch, that might help us understand this better. This might help us understand it better. Is the decision as to who you train, does it come from you or does it come from REB? Because then if it comes from REB or the Ministry of Education and you're told to implement, then a friend's question should be directed to REB or the Ministry of Education. Yes. But if it is up to you to decide who you train and when and what the impact would be, then Ephraim's question would be valid
but
to the extent that yes.
We're not, and again, at the end of the day, the question is, what is the state of the current sector?
No.
Responsibility in this case, whether responsibility is Ministry of Education's or Aegis Trust or Charlie's, the fact of the matter is, what is the state? And I'm curious, why?
I just want to partially let him off the hook in case it is not his fault that that his scores 6 out of 10.
So is it your fault?
So let him answer.
It is not anybody's fault.
It's
not anybody's fault. Yeah. But as Charles mentioned, and thank you, Charles, for jumping in, we do not choose the national teacher trainers. Okay. We do not select them. We don't have that mandate. So it is the Rwanda Education Board that selects these national teacher trainers and then calls in Aegis with other organizations to come in and play their role as depending on the cross-cutting theme that they've brought. But so it's not anybody's fault about the reach of 70,000. But the thing is, there's still room for improvement in a way that the way things are being done now is right. But as I've mentioned, the national teacher trainers or the sector-based trainers are not, their job is not only to sit and wait to train other teachers. They're also teachers in the classrooms.
For instance, they're teaching history, they're teaching geography, and then genocide studies or peace studies is cross-cutting. There's something they'll add an element of in their usual subjects.
But I just want to...
But before we do that...
From a stakeholder's perspective,
yes.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the delivery of that training?
No, I just wanted to chip in before he responds to that, because what we have to understand is the pathway that has led to the government of Rwanda to actually include peace education into the curriculum. Because you said it yourself, the move started long time ago. And indeed, a lot of work had to be done. So for me, it's not about how much work is remaining to be done. Because the first step is to establish the curriculum. So I'm of course a practitioner in the peace building and an educationist as well. So when you have the curriculum, then you begin thinking about the infrastructure in place, the people who will actually deliver the curriculum, the materials and the activities that will help them deliver. So I would say this is the stage we are discussing right now. So we shouldn't be so much pessimistic about reaching out to 70,000 teachers, even if we have to. Because if you look at the way we've worked from when Rwanda had to remove intoxicating, actually, contents in the curriculum that existed in before the genocide. And we still had books and we needed a lot of materials. So it took a long time to actually shift from that level to establish a new curriculum. So I would say, however much work we may remain to do,
let's appreciate it.
But very quickly, Charles. No, I think we also need to give Enoch a bit more time to understand his context of what he's saying. So we asked Enoch the same thing. Sorry, Eric, if you can also just briefly tell us how the work you do ties in with what we're talking about today before we go further in.
And especially for me, because I always thought that Never Again's job is just to organize a walk to remember. So please educate me.
Sure.
Yes.
So
please educate Charles.
We love youth being part of that as part of many educational activities. But as I mentioned in the beginning, we involved into peace education. And as an educationist, I understand that the curriculum is not limited to the overt, because when you're talking about the written curriculum that the Ministry of Education has established, it's also important to understand that there are other ways that are used to educate youth about the history of the genocide. And this is why we at Never Again Rwanda, for instance, we have peace clubs. And we have a lot of them. We have over 100 of them nationwide. And these clubs bring together young people from diverse backgrounds anyway to come and discuss, helped by, we often have the professionals who work with them to help them understand the history of genocide against Tutsis and its consequences, and provide them with a space to discuss. And doing so, youth can begin asking questions, which is what began happening. And through responding to these questions, we are educating them about the history. But at the same time, I want to give you an example, what we call rhetoric curriculum, for instance. When we're speaking like this on TV, in TV shows or radio shows, or even leaders or politicians talking about history, they are educating young people. And that's why, for instance, I believe in Rwanda, Never Again is going to be a reality if what we're doing in the present continues. Because when the leadership is talking, when leaders in different positions are talking, they talk about unity, they talk about reconciliation, they talk about the history of genocide against Tutsis. And we believe through doing this, youth are learning. So lastly, there is what you've mentioned, things like getting the young people to participate, not just in the Walk to Remember, which is really an important activity that we have every year. But at the same time, these discussions which are organized in the community around the commemoration period are really crucial, because this is the only opportunity we have to be educated about what happened. We listen to the stories of the survivors. We listen to people who actually were there. And this helps young people who might have even born out after the genocide and may not necessarily understand what happened.
Again, Dana, if I may, I think...
Yes, please go ahead. Are you fully educated though, or partially?
Yeah. I'm getting to understand Never Again.
Cool.
But
Good.
I think the bigger point that Ephraim, and allow me to be your self-appointed spokesman.
Yes, please.
We are hungry for change overnight, and I believe the point Ephraim was raising, that if we are to gauge from when we started in 2008 and 10 years later. Please don't get us wrong, Eric. We're not saying that there's nothing being done and we are not rubbishing what has been done. We appreciate that it takes a while to change curriculum, to write books, and to change mindset, and even to train teachers. You know, a few weeks ago here on the square, we're talking about how difficult it has been even to have English as a medium of communication amongst the teachers themselves. So we appreciate it's really a tall order. All we are saying is that please appreciate that the hunger for getting things changed overnight is very, very high. The appetite is extremely high. And earlier on, there was an example that was given of during the during the Walk to Remember, of kids, fine, you may appreciate they are under 20, they were definitely born after the genocide, and they're blowing kisses and taking selfies during the Walk to Remember. And they do not appreciate the circumstances under which we live today and what led us to get to that. So those are the things, those are just one example of the things that lead us to say, no, we want change yesterday. We want the impact of what you guys are doing, the appetite for us to have it implemented as soon as yesterday is extremely high. So we're not rubbishing what you guys are doing. We're hungry for quick success.
Can I just also add to that? Okay. And I think what Charlie is saying is that even us now, the conversation we want to have is, with all this work that we say is being done, a curriculum that has been in place 10 years, with the education and the involvement of young people and getting them to witness these things firsthand in terms of talking to survivors, how come there still exists a gap where you find young people so insensitive to these things? Yeah. Around the commemoration time, you can see young people don't seem to understand the gravity of what we're commemorating. And my question is, and I think our question here is, how come there seems to be a gap despite all the work that is being done?
Let me answer that first. We are looking at genocide studies in the school setting, but even in the school setting, we're not. We should look at all the stakeholders within the school itself. So it's not only the teachers, once we train the teachers, but also the students themselves, the parents of the students, but then also the decision makers or policy makers within the education structure. So if a student studies in the classroom about genocide studies, about the genocide against the Tutsi, and then goes back home to a parent who does not continue the conversation or who changes the conversation, then that alone is a gap. So what Aegis Trust is doing now, we have also trained parents. We have so far had like of nearly 10 workshops for parents, and what we're training the parents about is the history of Rwanda and the genocide and its consequences, but then also having fruitful conversations on sensitive topics, because the kids ask questions. They were not around when the genocide happened. So like, hey mom, what is this? Some of the parents, the survivors, have disabilities, and the child wants to understand how the parent got this disability.
But the question is...
So, to get to your question, the youth taking a selfie should not be looked at it in isolation, but should be looked at it in terms of the community itself. So that is why organizations like Never Again, like Aegis Trust, are working with the ministry, not only with the students in school, but also out of school, to ensure that all the different gaps are filled, so that the youth of today who are born post genocide have a clear understanding.
Enoch, can I ask you something? So actually I was about to ask you about the link between genocide studies and young people, especially when they go home to their familial settings. Obviously the influence is still very strong for many Rwandans. When they go back home, and the information and the influence they get vis-a-vis what they're taught in school via these studies. So I would like to ask you just a bit, going into a nitty-gritty situation, can you just break down, in genocide studies, for instance, what exactly do you teach, and what is what's different between genocide studies and peace studies? And if you can just give us a slight breakdown of what they entail, what actually happens in the classroom.
All right, thank you. So since 2016, genocide studies is a cross-cutting issue. So teachers of social studies in primary school, history and citizenship, general studies and communication, even ICT, they talk about genocide studies. But what they study about in genocide studies is, first of all, the history of Rwanda in terms of social, political, economic situation, even before, pre-colonial. And then we get into the post-colonial, and then we get into the genocide. But when you talk about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, we don't look at it in isolation. We look at it like why genocide happened, how it happened, and the consequences. But then we also talk about genocides in other countries to show that actually this is not
unique to Rwanda.
Yeah, it's not unique to Rwanda. It has happened also elsewhere.
So the Armenian genocide, the Herero genocide, the Bosnian.
Yes, so we talk about all this, and the students are able to see the differences between the genocide and the war, because some people don't see that difference. Say, it was a civil war, but say, no, it was a genocide, and then we talk about the differences. Why was this a genocide, and what makes it different from a war? And then after that, we talk about peace and values education comes in with social cohesion, positive values like empathy, critical thinking, personal responsibility. So peace and values education is more into the methodology the teacher is using, the attitude and the content. If a teacher is teaching in the classroom and he asks students to sit in a group and share, That's already peace and values education. So peace and values education is not taught in classroom as a subject. It is shown within the methodology and the attitude of the teacher. If a student is coming late to the classroom, the teacher does not just punish the student there and then, but he talks or she talks to the student and said, hey, what happened? In that way, so will say, the teacher is caring. That is already peace and values education.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
But you know, and I think this is, I want to ask this question, and you can both address it, even Charles. Yeah, even Charles, as my spokesperson.
Self-appointed.
You know, for me, the question around this has always been a question of humanity. And the question is, we have talked about theoretic education. And granted, I feel like you've talked of the methodology, and there's that aspect of practicality. But, you know, who teaches us our human values? Who is responsible for telling us this is what is humanly possible, this is what is humanly right, or this is what is wrong? That care and compassion. And I ask this because I feel like the gap that exists and the gap that we're talking about and why we are having this conversation is not a gap in theory. These kids probably know, they have probably been told, they probably understand. But it's the point where they value it personally. No. And the question, I think, for me, what I would want to know is, how can that be addressed? Or even beyond that, how is that being addressed right now?
Yeah, let me quickly comment about that, referring to the whole socialization process. Because we did the research in 2015 to look at the actors and approaches in the healing and reconciliation work here in Rwanda. And by doing so, we also looked at some of the factors which may contribute to people's learning or understanding their history or what happened to them. And I'm just bringing this because it's been observed that the Rwandan young people especially have thirst to learn about the history, and particularly the history of the genocide against Tutsis. So I would say that we cannot teach everything in the written curriculum, as I said. There is this whole socialization process. I remember some years back, around 7-10 years ago, we used to talk about what young people learn at home, because obviously we can say a lot of great things publicly, but when we reach home, it's a different story. And I want to also bring this into your attention, referring to, as an educationist, what we call new curriculum, as in zero. Because I want, Ishna, who's a person who wrote a lot about this, mentioned that somehow, somewhere, some people are empowered to make conscious decisions as to what is being included and what is being excluded in the written curriculum. So as a result, people want to learn. And they learn it through this whole socialization process. So I would say that how do we learn this, as you rightly put your question? I would say it will be a responsibility of the society, not just schools, the parents, to educate the young ones. And I would also say that, as I said, politicians have a lot of a big role to play in the process through things like Itorero. I appreciate the fact that right now people go to Itorero, Urunana Rw'Urungano, if you've watched. So we may speak about a lot of gaps still in place, but at least people are acknowledging that.
They're cognizant of the progress. So we'll be back after the break, and we're going to answer a couple of more questions in that regard. Please stay tuned. We'll be back after a few minutes. Very interesting. Good evening and welcome back to our show. My name is Dan MPC, part of The Square, and I'm joined by our panelists for today. We have Enoch Semuamba from Aegis Trust, and we have Eric Mahoro from Never Again Rwanda. As always, Charles and Ephraim are with us. Tonight we have been discussing the education as a tool of genocide prevention, especially amongst the youth in Rwanda. And we've been discussing various things to do with this tool of prevention, education, the state of curricula in Rwanda, from primary to secondary to higher learning institutions regarding genocide and peace studies. But the next half of this show, and I want to engage you on this, is to do with genocide ideology. Not really amongst the youth, but just generally cross-cutting across all ages in the country. So the National Commission on the Fight Against Genocide, CNLG, released a study in April 2016 called The State of Genocide Ideology in Rwanda from 1995 to 2015. And this study indicated the genocide ideology amongst Rwandans stood at 16.1% in 2015 as opposed to 81.2% just after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. So, and this is to all of you, especially our guests. Do you think, in your opinion, that genocide ideology is something that we can eradicate in our generation? Or how many generations do you think this sort of thinking will just more or less disappear? And what do you think needs to happen for this to occur?
Just before Enoch comes in, I can see he's itching to say something about this, and I'll link it to what we were discussing earlier on in the first half. Chinua Achebe, one of the great African writers, wrote in one of his books that a fool at 40 will die a fool. And I'll link that with what you said earlier on, Enoch, that however much you do from an education perspective, these kids will go back to their homes. And if they are poisoned at home, it's, my interpretation was that all that will have been done at school will be, multiplied by zero. Yeah. And the 16% that Diana has just given us in terms of the genocide ideology, that the 16 that needs to be reduced to the zero, I believe the 16% is because of a generation. I believe the 16% is the parents who still harbor that ideology. And against that background, I would be keen for especially the educationist, Eric in particular, to understand that the proportion to which we put emphasis on the youth versus the parents. At the risk of sounding ridiculous, let the dead bury the dead. And let's concentrate on these ones who are blowing kisses during the walk to remember. That is where the biggest problem is. But again, as Diana said, that 16%, yes, for sure it is a major concern. I am 100% sure that you're not going to educate them. Those need to be sort of handled more or less with masculine hands. But I don't envy your job, Eric and Enoch. I can even. Let's allow Enoch to just answer the question, because this is a topic we're going to talk about until the cows come home. Genocide ideology, and also in your experience, how it is being addressed in schools. But just back to my question. Just personally, is this something, how many generations do you think it will take to eradicate, and what must be done?
I may not have the actual figures of how many generations it might take, but right now we are using a methodology of storytelling, because some of these youth they've been born after the genocide. So I think, as Eric mentioned, that some of them might think this is a movie, that this never happened. So we are using a storytelling methodology which puts a face on the tragic events that happened. So we have testimonies from survivors, testimonies from rescuers, testimonies from perpetrators who come and talk about what they went through during the genocide. So even when you go to the Kigali Genocide Memorial in the museum, you'll see all these photographs, all these memorabilia, all the videos. So the youth, those who are blowing kisses in Walk to Remember,
or taking selfies,
they're not taking selfies because they don't, maybe they don't value what is being told, but they're taking selfies because there's still some bit of, in my opinion, some bit of ignorance on how tragic this was. Ignorance on what this means to a country that is still healing 24 years later. Ignorance on what this means to their parents, to the community, to the teachers, to the families that were affected. I think this is what is being addressed right now. Eric talked about the peace clubs, which are all over the country. That is already an initiative which is working towards, because the youth will be curious, why a peace club? We have peace. Why do we have a peace club? And then that is where the conversation will start. Oh, this is what happened. This is why there's a peace club. This is why we need to engage in conversations. So I think the genocide ideology, I will not talk more about the generations, but if we look at it with all the stakeholders, the parents that Charles is talking about, they might not play a big role, but to a kid of 5-6 years, to them, their father, mother is the wisest person.
So what it's a heroic figure.
Yes, it's a heroic figure. So what this parent says is, when they're doing homework with this kid at home, what the parent says stays in this kid's mind, and the kid will tell another kid, who will tell another kid, and it will spread like that. So Eric,
yeah, but I would say there is the law, which actually specifies what the genocide ideology is to begin with. And I think with the work done on the law, I would say we are hopeful that probably there will be a decrease in the demonstration of genocide ideology. But the concern is that people actually who demonstrate the genocide ideology are not those who we would say are ignorant when we go into the educational terminologies. There would be people who hold degrees. There would be people who completed their masters. But because the denial begins with perpetrating the genocide, so there's a natural process of denying what happened, which actually begins with perpetrating that crime. And when that is over, there is also a tendency to sort of hide the truth. And this is what is happening. So most of the young people who demonstrate this the genocide tendencies or ideology as per the law have often learned it from somewhere. And this is, for me, this is why I would capitalize on critical thinking. It is really crucial. And this is what we are doing at Never Again, to make sure that these young people have the capacity to think critically about these statements being made by the deniers all over the world and inside the country. And it's going to be a very strong weapon to fight against the genocide ideology. So maybe I would also illustrate one quote from a participant of our Peace Building Institute, which actually brings together young people from all over the world to learn from Rwanda's history. She said that the will of the Rwandan people is very strong to move forward. Of course, there is. We may not generalize that we are being held back by these deniers who actually have an agenda, because there is also a large number of Rwandans who want to push to tell the truth, who want to move forward and build a country that really is uphold its values and which understands where it's coming from. This is very critical. And I would say if we continue to educate our youth on this history and never shy away to speak about it, because after all, there are those young people who are also affected, even those born after the genocide. You may have evidence about the transgenerational trauma cases that we have. We talked about it on April 3rd in our conference with the youth. So there are those who are affected, but as we continue to educate them, I believe we will be able, it may take edges, because as I said, there are people with an agenda, but at the same time, we will really be able to.
Can I just add something? And Ephraim, I'll say something briefly, and I know there's a lot you wanted to say. But while we're on this topic of the genocide against the Tutsi that happened in 1994, I had the fortune of reading an article that came my way earlier this week. I mean, I've always known about these things whereby, is there really a difference between Tutsi and Hutu? You know, for crying out loud, this was a scientific-based journal that had some elements of gene mapping, you know, and it tied in with historical things. There's so many historical inaccuracies that prove the Tutsis were actually not from Rwanda. They came from Abyssinia through Ethiopia, and this and this. And then, you know, some of the history classes that I know were being taught pre-94 would say, and the Hutus came from Chad and settled here, and they owned the land, and so forth, and so have you. That kind of break this down, and I think in terms of the generations, in how this will be watered down, where we will, the hate and the mistrust and the historical inaccuracies that are still present will be known for what they are. And what I'm trying to say here is that there is really no specific, based on these scientific articles that I read, a difference, because you can't say there are two tribes. You know, it's the same language, it's the same culture, it's the same, you know, this is not like a different country where there's specific tribes that have different history. So these are some things I think that we need to factor in this education of peace, education of genocide, to actually say the foundation of these tragedies is scientifically and historically, in most cases, inaccurate. So people can understand.
Eric nailed it. Huh?
Yes.
Eric actually said that the biggest problem is amongst the educated. The ignorant know nothing. Irrespective of their age, they know nothing. So it is easier to educate them.
Exactly. So amongst the educated people, these are conversations. We are not really having them now. It's more about tolerance and forgiveness, but we need to go to the pinnacle and even start questioning. But Hutus and Tutsis, let's actually address this issue. What is this big difference? This myth that if we track down historically, does it even really exist to start with? That sort of educated conversation amongst
Diana, what is challenging, because actually that conversation is much deeper than that, because as you mentioned, youth learn from various spaces. So, and I believe it's important that we also created these spaces where we have people who are able to tell the truth and who can give the facts about our history, because if we don't, youth will be educated by those cowards who will reverse our history. So what the key word for me is here is, let's create a space to talk about the young people. And most of the youth I spoke to up to now still tell me that when they ask their parents about what happened, they tell them that, you know, this is complicated and this is not easy to talk about. And this keeps coming as a consistent answer. So as we do this, young people seek the truth, because as I mentioned again, they know what should be excluded in what they learn and what should be included. So for me, it's time to create a space, but we also looking at what unites us, because that's why I said that when youth go to Urunana Gurungano, for instance, which is a space established by the government. By the way, I want to see more happening with the civil society organizations as well, because we operating in a particular context. The Rwandan context is a post-genocide context. So you could be doing business, as you said, but not the people you are working with have been affected by the history of genocide. So let's create a space, at least for the youth to learn.
And Eric, just a quick one before Ephraim jumps in, talk about the space. Actually, we are currently having intergenerational dialogues within different communities in the countryside, where we have the elders come in with the youth and they discuss at length. So that is just to kind of talk more about the space where the youth ask these questions to the elders who were there who were there during the genocide against the Tutsi. So the youth have very many questions, and these intergenerational dialogues, sometimes even they're supposed to be 1 day, 2 days, sometimes they go through a week, because the youth still have these questions, and then the elders help talk about the history, talk about what exactly happened. Some of them were rescuers, some of them were survivors, so they talk about what really happened, and the youth learn more because they have that space, as you've mentioned, and they can listen to people who were there.
Sure. Yeah. So what I wanted to say earlier, and I think it's in line with what they've said, genocide ideology, at least in context of Rwanda, was something that was done over a vast number of generations. This is something that took time to develop, and even when we talked last week about the different stages of genocide, one of those was denial, which is an ideology in itself. And when you look at the, again, coming towards dealing with it, you have to address, or at least you have to supplant the roots that were planted decades ago. As much as we talk of the dynamism of the way of life, the culture always changes. The fact of the matter is that genocide ideology has a genealogy, in the sense that it will move from the grandparents to the parents to the children, to the children, to the grandchildren, unless it is dealt with somewhere along the line. He talked about, we say, let the old be old, let's address the children. There was also a mention of inaccuracies historically. For me, when I look at how we can best deal with that, again, focusing on the young people is one. Two, addressing some of the inaccuracies historically that fueled the ideology. Yes, because at the end of the, at the heart of most of this ideology, this divisive ideology that led to this, was very inaccurate information, or at least very inaccurate. At least now it's historic, but at the time it was current, and people were just saying, "Oh, there's a difference. Oh, this, that," and you find that it created that it's what fueled, or at least formed, the foundation of the ideology. If we can address that, especially, and again, like I said, we have, I feel like we have the infrastructure. You mentioned infrastructure earlier. The infrastructure to address that with the young people is being laid, and I feel like it's more advanced than any other infrastructure we might have currently. If we can use that infrastructure to, and I think we are doing it now, to supplant that ideology, and then we work towards ensuring that there's a sustainability to it, which means involvement of the young people towards maintaining that infrastructure and also building on it to develop this new narrative where there are actual accuracies that are correcting the old ones. I think for me, we can start to address the issues of ideology.
I agree. I agree. We left with a minute and a half, and I would like us to just give our closing remarks, starting with you and Eric, Mahoro, and Charles.
All right, so
a minute and a half.
All right. Thank you for having me here today. The last remarks would be that peace is everyone's business. We should not say, "Oh, Aegis Trust, oh, never again Rwanda." These organizations are the ones supposed to do it. No. Peace is everyone's business, regardless of the walk of life that you have, regardless of the gender, regardless of where you come from. Peace is everyone's business. That's my last remark.
Thank you very much.
I think my last remarks would be, he talked of society at large. And when you look at, even the reason why we're having this conversation is that the role of society, or at least in our cultures, it was the role of society to discipline the child. It was the role of society to ensure that the child was going in the right direction. And I feel like we have a role to play, all of us as society, people, parents, teachers, just onlookers in society, to ensure that the next generation, or even in my case, my fellow age mates, are perceiving these things a certain way. And I think for me, that would be my closing remarks. In line with what he says, it's everybody's task.
Business.
So I applaud the tone set by the government of Rwanda in addressing the issues to do with the genocide ideology for now. And I believe that working in this context where we have a space to talk about these issues, it's now a responsibility for we, the actors from various sectors, to work together and make sure we educate the youth who will uphold the unity of this nation.
Thank you, Eric. Charles?
I'll pick it from the tone. When the government is not happy, it will do very drastic decisions, to make very drastic decisions. They just overhauled the entire Rwanda Education Board management, the entire echelon. I don't know whether it's because Enoch said he wasn't happy with the trickle-down effect of their programs. Yeah, but I don't know whether you're happy that REB has been dissolved. The top echelon has been dissolved. But
safe to say no.
Back to a serious note, let's take these actors, Eric and Aaron's, and Enoch and Eric's remarks extremely seriously, in the sense that the impact that they are making may not have a trickle-down effect because of the parameters within which they work. One being the society, two being the family, and also the fact that even though they are training teachers, those teachers have other jobs. They even have other subjects that they teach at the local level. The inspectors do inspect other things, I believe, including hygiene and what have you. So we need to take this extremely seriously if it's going to have a significant impact. Yes.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. It was a very engaging and enlightening conversation. I hope you enjoyed it where you are in your homes. Thank you for joining us. The Square, as always, Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. and at 9 p.m. and a rerun every Thursday at 2:30 p.m. Catch us next week. It was lovely being with you this evening. Thank you.